Hello, everyone. This is your Professor Adam Dunstan. The topic for today is political systems and social control, where we ask questions like how do societies encourage or enforce certain sort of norms, certain sort of way of being? How do they get people to buy in or not buy in, but have to follow certain like social order? Who wields power in a given society? How do some societies come to have extremely powerful leaders that can, enforce their will by force? And how is it that other societies do not have that? How are conflicts resolved within and between societies across the anthropological record? How do cultures make, or rather communities, make decisions? Who becomes the leaders, if anyone? And are power hierarchies inevitable? I consider these to actually be very, very important questions. So it's not really politics today as in political parties in the US. Rather, we're talking about a much broader set, and I think very fundamental set of questions of how is it that power ever becomes wielded in human history. So that's where we're going today. So the learning objectives are threefold then. Discuss the anthropological concepts of politics and power, and we're going to need to develop that in such a way that we can talk about how power works across all sorts of different cultures, across all sorts of human time. Because remember, that's what we're doing as anthropologists, looking at all human cultures across all time. So we're not confining it to what we mean by politics, but sort of a broader sense of how does power and decision-making work across humanity. Discuss 4 forms of political organization that we'll need to develop some new terms to talk about that. So we'll talk about band, tribe, chiefdom, and state, which you read about. And then we're going to talk about formal and informal social control. So I want to start by looking at the Narmer palette, which is from roughly 3000 BCE. I want you to just take a look at that for a second, maybe even pause the video and ask yourself, what do you see? What's going on there? You probably came to the correct conclusion that this big person who's drawn much bigger than everybody else, or bigger than most, in this case, almost like a giant, is a king, and you'd be right, that's King Narmer. And you might notice this large crown, it's called the double crown, and these intertwined lion heads. And what's going on there is that he had just unified the upper and lower kingdom and sort of started off what we more often mean when we say pharaoh, sort of the unified, deified ruler over both kingdoms in ancient Egypt. And now you may specifically have noticed, though, this and this. So he seems to have some large thing on his head. It's the double crown that shows that he has this authority, as well as a scepter or weapon of some sort. And then you also see that he's grabbing that guy by the head, and it looks like he's going to commit some violence on him, whether that's a bludgeoning or something more severe. And a really important question, is how does either of those things ever become normal? How does it ever come to be that some people in a society get regarded as, extra important and over everybody else, crowns, as it were? And how is it that some people in society get to be put into a position where they can wield power, physical power, over other human beings? And how does that ever become normal? Now, there's often this notion that kind of goes around in our popular discourse that that's just sort of inevitable, that the strong person in a society, or the strong dude in a society, as it's often thought of, sort of just becomes the leader and just comes on top, and that's just sort of natural human hierarchy or something. And that just does not match actual archaeological or ethnographic data. That is sometimes the case. That is often not the case. We have lots and lots of societies in which something like this would be unthinkable, where there are leaders, but the leaders are pretty informal, or they are formal and people do recognize them, but they don't involve themselves in too many decisions. And generally speaking, it would be unthinkable for them to sort of try to beat somebody else up to enforce their will. That would be unthinkable in all sorts of societies. And indeed, we believe that was the case for the earliest human groups, which don't really show true signs of hierarchy in most areas until much later in the archaeological record. And indeed, in some parts of the world, until pretty recently in anthropological terms, within the last few hundred years. So we're going to be thinking about how is it that some societies go the way of ancient Egypt, as it were, and some societies do not, and what are some of the different pathways they can go down. I'll share another example. It's the Natchez tribe from sort of Louisiana, roughly, area, and the Great Sun. And I will mention at the outset, we have some historiographic issues here, by which I mean we're not sure exactly what we know and if it's reliable, because a lot of the information about this practice comes from the writings of early French colonizers, explorers, and clergy. And, on the one hand, they seem to want to, well, they were writing down what they thought was interesting, but the question is always, did they understand what they were seeing, and did they have a bias in what they were representing? And the answer to the first question might be partial and probably not entirely. And the answer to the second question is, yeah, there's probably bias. And so bear that in mind. But some of this is backed up by other sources of data. But basically, you had the great son, who was a chief over all the other chiefs. So each village had a chief, but you had a chief that was over all the other chiefs, essentially a king. And that's how kind of early Europeans saw this. It was matrilineal. The great son, the king, received this from his mother. And so, interestingly, it's a good example of how matrilineality does not always imply matriarchy. So the power came from the mother, but ultimately the political power there, at least from what they could tell by the time the French showed up, and it might have been different before that, right? It very well could have been different. But when they showed up, it appeared that the power was vested in a man, specifically the great son, as well as his brother. But there was also women with power in his royal court as well. Anyways, with the great son, though, there's profound gestures of respect and veneration. People would like, for one thing, a really big thing is people couldn't see the great son eat unless they were like really, really close family, or just under like really specific conditions, specific ritual occasions, I think. So, and also people had to like bow and like move backwards and wail when they would see them. As you can imagine, that makes it pretty hard to like live around the great son, because there's all these like, oh man, I have to constantly like try not to like look at the great son while he's eating. I have to constantly like back up and wail, like, okay, it's a lot. So that led to the somewhat interesting situation where, you know, he was sort of the authority. He lived in this thing called the Grand Village, but the Grand Village often didn't have many people living in it, sometimes more or less depending on ceremonies that were going on. But for a lot of the time, people mainly, a lot or like most of the people lived out in these outlying villages. Archaeological data shows us that some of those villages actually had more wealth in terms of trade goods and larger than the Grand Village itself. And sort of ethnographic or historic information suggests that in those villages, there would be like emissaries of the great son, like his kind of bureaucracy that's off in the other villages trying to tell people what to do. And the people would sometimes follow them and sometimes sort of tell them to take a hike, and listen a lot more to their local chief or just their own sort of what they wanted to do as a villager. And so the king is sort of, but at the same time, within the grand village where the king is, the king has, or sorry, I shouldn't say king, I should say the great son. The great son has profound power, would sometimes apparently execute people, would sometimes take property from people. Again, assuming the early records are correct, and that's a huge if, but that they could take property from people, sometimes take lives from people, which is really, really almost unheard of, certainly very, very unusual for indigenous North American societies prior to colonialism. That's like really, 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 really super unusual. One of the only cases I can think of, in fact. So he had, though, this almost like profound power, and even like royal retainers, like people that worked with the great son, who upon the great son's death would then willingly end their own life. And so just like, wow, like this is like very, very, very hierarchical, right? In a continent where that's extremely unusual, historically, extremely unusual. But weirdly enough, or rather interestingly enough, mainly in one village, right? Mainly in one village, the king's power or the great son's power starts to diffuse pretty rapidly when you move beyond that village. Again, his emissaries could be sort of sometimes listened to, but sometimes sort of not. And other villages might even be more powerful than his village. So profound power in a very limited geographic scope. Very fascinating example of hierarchy. So some thought questions that, you know, we might think of then is the ones that I started with, especially when we think about the Narmer palette, the pharaohs, and the great son. Who wields power in a society? How do some societies come to have extremely powerful leaders? Some do not. And what is social power to begin with? How do societies enforce norms? How do they make decisions together? All of that. So a few terms to know as we start going here. Egalitarian. Anthropologists use that term to mean societies in which there is minimal, so relatively few differences in power, prestige, or wealth between adult members. By power, I mean social power, the ability to get people to do something in a society that you want them to do. By prestige, I mean sort of like we recognize you as better, or maybe not better, but more important in a certain way, or higher up in a certain hierarchy in our brains. And by wealth, I mean however that society defines wealth. It could be a lot of different things. It's not always currency, but whatever wealth is in that society. So egalitarian means that there's not much differences between power, prestige, and wealth between person A and person B, assuming they're adults. Obviously, if in any given society, parents tend to have authority over their own children, right? There's a hierarchy, an implicit hierarchy of like adult versus child in a family dynamic. But generally speaking, among the adult members of the society, the differences are pretty minor. We call that egalitarianism. Now, notably and importantly, as we examine societies across the world, we want to understand that when anthropologists use the term egalitarian, we do not mean uniform. There's often, for example, a gender division of labor where men tend to be more involved in larger game hunting and women do hunt but smaller animals, or they don't hunt at all and they mainly do plant gathering or processing. So it doesn't mean everybody's doing the same thing. And it may be that your role is to some degree defined by one's birth, but that's not the same as sort of like somebody can come and like execute you or something like that, right? So that's egalitarian societies. Hierarchical societies are, well, societies that aren't egalitarian, right? It's where you have some sort of difference in power, prestige, and or wealth. And indeed, archaeologically and historically speaking, we find that it is very often the case that societies that the power and wealth hierarchy tends to develop together. They tend to go together, and groups of certain people become more wealthy and more powerful in a society. Pharaoh's a great example. So what do politics mean then? You know, when we use that term in everyday conversation, we mean stuff like this, right? What's going on with the legislative or executive branch of our government? Anthropologists mean something much broader. We don't mean the very narrow sense that we sometimes use it of like a formal politics or centralized authority, written laws, governments. Instead, our point is, you know, you might be saying, well, that is what politics is, right? But that's, in our sense, we're using the term broader to mean power, right? Every society has to figure out who makes decisions and how decisions come to be implemented. And so politics in that sense exists in every culture, but it varies tremendously. So, you know, every society though has to deal with the question of social order. There's some sort of rules and expectations of what people do, and every society has that, every single society. Now, are they static? The answer is no. They change over time, obviously. And to some degree, a lot of anthropology since the 70s has been about showing what we sometimes talk about like contestation or negotiation, that basically power in a society, you know, there's hegemonic forces often at the top that are trying to enforce a certain form of order, and there's people that are resisting or pushing back. And so social norms are not sort of static, but they exist. There's social order in every society. And you might ask yourself why. And I suppose to some degree, it's obvious that at least some basic social order has to exist so that people aren't sort of just, you know, bludgeoning each other every time they have a disagreement. But of course, the social order can be range from very minimal to very, very elaborate and strict. It can range from very voluntary to extremely coercive. It can range from one in which most people have their needs met and a sense of self-fulfillment to extremely oppressive, right? So all sorts of different social orders. Social order, calling it that doesn't imply a good social order any more than, you know, ordering your desk in a certain way means it's a good way to order your desk. It could be the worst way to order your desk. But the point is that every society falls upon eventually a set of expectations. And then those tend to be enforced by versions of social control. Even in the most egalitarian society with tremendous amount of freedom for individuals, there tends to be some way of making sure again that people don't just sort of bludgeon each other when they have a disagreement, some way of enforcing social norms. So that's where we talk about social control. It can be formal, rigorously spelled out, and coercive, enforced by force. It could be formal, but not enforced by force. It could be informal, right? Something as simple as somebody's talking on a phone too loudly in a restaurant, or horribly talking on a cell phone and being distracted while they're driving. Well, actually, that's in some ways less bad than texting on a cell phone and being distracted. And then we glare at them or we honk at them. That is social power. It's or social control. It's not a very strong social control. They can ignore us, but we do the glare because it works, right? At least some of the time. And so that's a form of informal social power. All right, now I want to talk about the 4 forms of political organization, which are band, tribe, chiefdom, and state. And I'm going to pause